Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going into the world of the medieval witch.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, we're using The Witch of the Middle Ages by Jules Michelet.
Okay.
Trying to kind of see how this figure of the witch, how she changed over time, and what her story can tell us about the Middle Ages in general.
Cool.
Yeah, so we're really looking at, was she just this pure figure of evil, or was there something more complex going on?
Well, and that's something that Michelet really tries to grapple with in his book. I mean, he goes beyond, just sort of recounting the historical facts, and he tries to really understand what is the deeper meaning behind the witch. Was she merely a figure of evil, or did she embody something, more profound?
I'm curious about what he noticed in terms of how women were viewed, during this period.
Yeah, well, he observed this fascinating transition. In a lot of primitive societies, women were often the spiritual leaders. They were the dreamers, the healers, the ones connected to nature. But then by the Middle Ages, this figure, she becomes the persecuted witch.
So it's quite a shift.
Yeah, it's a dramatic shift.
What caused this change in how she was viewed?
Well, Michelet, he attributes this transformation to the shift from paganism to Christianity. So as the church kind of gained power, nature, and especially female spiritual power that was associated with nature, it became demonized. So, paganism revered the natural world. You had female deities that embodied its forces, but Christianity kind of positioned nature as something to be subdued.
Controlled.
Right, controlled. So women who, still clung to those older beliefs, who practiced folk medicine and maintained their connection with nature, they were suddenly seen as threats.
So in a way, they were carrying on that tradition of being connected to nature, but now it was seen in this negative light.
Exactly. And Michelet, he stresses that for centuries, the witch, she was the primary healer for the common people. She was the village herbalist, the midwife. She was the source of comfort and cures in a world where medical knowledge was really limited.
But wouldn't the church see that as a direct challenge to their authority?
Oh, absolutely. The church, they saw folk medicine as this pagan tradition. It was a threat to their worldview. So they demonized it. They called it witchcraft and associated it with the devil.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
It's interesting that he brings up Paracelsus.
Yeah.
That famous Renaissance physician. He actually claimed to have learned a lot from witches.
Right.
So what kind of knowledge was he getting from these women, and how did that challenge the medical establishment?
Well, Paracelsus, he rejected the traditional medical practices of his time. He was looking for knowledge from different sources, kind of unconventional sources, including witches. And from them, he learned about herbal remedies, folk healing practices, things that, went against the grain of the medical wisdom of the time.
So he was really pushing the boundaries.
Yeah, and this really challenged the church's control over knowledge and healing. It showed this real tension between the established systems of power and these alternative practices.
It makes you wonder how much knowledge was lost just because it didn't fit with what the people in power wanted. So Michelet also talks about how the witch fit into everyday life, especially for peasant women in the early Middle Ages. And he describes their lives as, really isolated and vulnerable. So what were the circumstances that made them so isolated and vulnerable?
Well, these women often faced a life of solitude, right? Their husbands were frequently away. They were either, working the fields or off fighting wars, or even, succumbing to diseases. And they were living in these pretty simple, poorly constructed homes that really didn't offer much protection from the elements or the dangers of that time.
I can imagine that would be really frightening.
Oh, yeah. And it was in this context of fear and isolation that they sought out, solace and protection wherever they could find it. And Michelet talks about this belief in the fae, or the domestic goblin.
What was that all about?
Yeah, well, the fae, or the domestic goblin, it was this kind of helpful spirit that was connected to the witch. So it's a more benevolent aspect of this, often demonized figure.
So almost like a protector.
Yeah, a caretaker. She was a protector of the vulnerable, even animals. And it shows, how people craved this sense of comfort and protection in this, harsh world.
It makes her seem a little more human.
Exactly. It shows that her role wasn't just about, spells and curses, but also about this deep human need for security and support.
Speaking of spells and curses, Michelet tackles this whole idea of the pact with the devil. And, he kind of questions this idea that it was just a woman, choosing to sell her soul for evil power.
Yeah.
What's his alternative take on this pact?
Well, he really wants us to think about the societal pressures that might have led a woman to seek power, from any source, even those that were considered forbidden. Feudal life was incredibly brutal, right? It was
Yeah.
full of poverty, abuse, and a real lack of legal protection, especially for women. And to really grasp this, we need to understand the context of their lives. For instance, he talks about this really, really awful custom of the rite of the first night.
What was that? Can you tell the listeners what that was all about?
Well, basically, it was a custom that allowed feudal lords to um, basically take advantage of a peasant woman on her wedding night.
That's awful. I mean, it's hard to even imagine that being considered acceptable.
I know, it was truly horrific, and it just really underscores how little power women had during that time. And it's in this context, right? When you think about these circumstances, that the devil, who was often portrayed as this powerful figure, a rebellious figure, he could have represented a way to fight back against these systems that were trapping these women.
So it's almost like he was a symbol of resistance.
Yeah, and the pact with the devil, it could have been this plea for agency, a way to try to get some control in a world where they had none. It's about survival, not necessarily evil.
Right. So maybe it was more about, making a deal with the devil, not for evil purposes, but just to survive.
Right, exactly. And Michelet uses this ancient Greek myth, the myth of the Bride of Corinth, to illustrate this point.
Oh, tell me about that myth. What does it tell us about the choices women faced?
Well, the myth tells the story of this young woman, right? She's forced into a convent by her mother. She has to sacrifice her own love and happiness. But her betrothed, he refuses to let her go. So he calls her back from the grave.
Wow.
It's this powerful tale about the desire for love and life, even when you're up against these religious restrictions and societal pressures.
So it challenges this assumption that women are just, willingly choosing the devil.
Mm.
Maybe for some of them, he actually symbolized a chance at love, at life, at freedom, things that were denied to them in the, so-called acceptable ways.
Exactly. It's about understanding the complexity of their lives and the choices that they made.
And those choices were often made in situations where there weren't any good options.
Right. Their motivations may have been driven by desperation, this desire for survival, or a longing for something more than society would allow them.
So we've seen this image of the witch kind of shift from spiritual leader to persecuted healer, and now to this complex figure who might have been driven to, make these deals with the devil out of desperation. It's really clear that the context of the time played such a role in how people saw her. But I'm wondering, how did the concept of the devil himself change?
Oh, that's a great question.
And how did that affect how the witch was seen?
Well, around the year 1000, the concept of hell, which was kind of this abstract idea before, really shifted into this very physical and tangible place of suffering.
And did it happen at the same time as the rise of feudal violence and that brutality of the time? It seems like there might be a connection there.
Oh, absolutely. The imagery of hell really mirrored the horrors that people were experiencing in their everyday lives. War, disease, poverty.
Yeah.
Imagine living through that kind of turmoil, and then on top of that, you've got this vivid imagery of eternal damnation being preached from the pulpit.
It's almost like they were using fear to maintain control.
It's definitely a possibility. And this emphasis on a physical, terrifying hell really set the stage for the witch hunts that would follow. Because if hell was this real place, this tangible place of eternal suffering, then who better to blame for those evils than the witch?
She becomes the scapegoat.
Exactly, the scapegoat for all of these anxieties, fears, uncertainties of the time.
So you've got this perfect storm brewing, this societal anxiety, this changing view of the devil, and then the witch who becomes this convenient scapegoat for all the fears.
Right. It was almost inevitable that she would be caught in the crosshairs of these powerful forces. Her image, already associated with pagan traditions and folk practices, was really easily twisted and distorted to fit this narrative of a powerful and terrifying devil.
Okay, so that leads us to the Sabbath. It started out as these simple gatherings, maybe leftovers from the old pagan rituals, and then they became something much more subversive. Can you walk us through how that happened and how the role of the witch changed within these gatherings?
Sure. The Sabbath, which began as these small, simple gatherings, really transitioned into a direct challenge to the church. It culminated in what we call the Black Mass, a sort of ritualistic inversion of Christian practices.
Okay.
And what's really significant is that women played a central role in this.
So they were like leading these rituals, basically going against the whole patriarchal religious structure.
Mhm.
Do you think that was a form of protest? Were they trying to take back power and kind of express their discontent?
It's certainly possible to see it that way. I mean, these women and those who followed them were creating their own space for power and expression outside of the church. They took the symbols of their oppression and literally turned them on their heads. It was this powerful, if dangerous, act of defiance.
So they used the tools of their oppressors to empower themselves. But, amidst all of this, Michelet reminds us that the witch was still very much connected to healing, to medicine. He talks about these plants called the comforters or the Solane family. Can you tell us a little more about these plants and why they were so risky to use?
These plants were known for their healing properties, but they could also be quite dangerous. They had poisonous effects if not used properly. It really speaks to the witches' knowledge and courage that they would work with these powerful substances, especially in a society that demonized any kind of knowledge that was outside of the church's control.
So they were taking a big risk, basically risking accusations of poisoning and witchcraft just to help people.
They were, absolutely. They were walking a tightrope. It shows the desperation of the people who sought them out and the bravery of the witches who were willing to help, no matter the consequences.
Right, because what might have been seen as healing by some could easily be twisted and called witchcraft by others, especially by the church. But in the end, this whole thing with the witch hunts, the fear, the demonization, it all kind of faded away as the Middle Ages came to an end, right?
It did, yeah. The rise of science and reason started to challenge the belief in witchcraft, and the church's authority started to give way to scientific inquiry.
So as the world changed, the witch became less relevant.
Exactly. Even the devil, he became less threatening, more of a comical figure in some depictions. It was like the world was waking up from a long, dark dream. But even though the witch faded from view, her story had a lasting impact on how we view women, power, and the dangers of demonizing those who have knowledge outside the mainstream.
And this is where Michelet's work gets really interesting for us today. It's not just about the past. It's a reflection on how we deal with people who challenge the status quo, who have knowledge or power that we're uncomfortable with.
Right. It raises the question, do we seek to understand them, or do we fall back on fear and demonization?
It's a question that's still relevant today. So as we move on in our deep dive, let's keep that question in mind.
It's almost like the witch became this symbol of the clash between the old world and the new, like, caught between paganism and the rise of Christianity.
Right, and as Christianity took hold, the church really started to control knowledge, didn't they?
Yeah, they had a tight grip on information. Anyone outside of that, like the witches with their herbs and folk remedies, they were seen as a threat.
So like we talked about before, those women who kept those traditions alive, they became targets.
Exactly. They represented this alternative source of knowledge, almost a different kind of authority, which, well, the church didn't like that. They often responded by trying to, well, demonize and basically stamp out anything that didn't fit their worldview.
But we have to remember, it wasn't just about religion, was it? Like, life in the Middle Ages, especially for women, it was brutal. Michelet doesn't shy away from that.
No, he doesn't. He really paints this stark picture of how isolated and vulnerable they were, especially peasant women. Think about it. Their husbands are gone, off fighting, working the land. So many died from disease or war, too.
So these women are left to fend for themselves, raise kids, deal with everything alone.
Pretty much, yeah. And don't forget about that horrific right of the first night custom. I mean, can you imagine? It's just a brutal reminder of how little power they had.
It's just awful.
It is, yeah. And it's within that context, with all that going on, that we have to try and understand the witch. She wasn't just some scary figure. For a lot of people, she was a source of, real hope.
What's that duality again, right, that makes her so interesting? She's both feared and needed.
Right. She represents that dark side, but also this, source of healing, of comfort. Michelet really emphasizes that. People were terrified of witches, but they also relied on them.
She was the healer, the midwife, right? The one you went to when nobody else could help. I wonder if just going to her was in itself an act of rebellion, like going against the church, against the accepted way of doing things.
That's an interesting thought. Her power didn't just come from, some pact with the devil. It came from the community, from the people who believed in her.
But even that kind of power, even if it's just from people needing her, it would still be seen as dangerous to those in charge, wouldn't it?
For sure. The witch, just by existing, by helping people, she kind of challenged the whole system. And then you add in the Sabbath, right? It starts as these little gatherings, maybe just carrying on old traditions, but they became much more than that.
And don't forget, the women are leading these rituals,
Mhm.
basically taking control of something that's totally outside the church.
Exactly. It was a rejection of the whole hierarchy, like taking back that spiritual power that had been denied to them. You have to ask, was it a form of protest?
Maybe. I mean, think about what these women were dealing with. So much upheaval, the old ways disappearing, and the new way, well, it didn't offer them much. So maybe they had to find that power somewhere, even if it meant going against the church.
Right, they had to find their own way. And that brings us back to this idea of the pact with the devil. Michelet really makes us rethink that whole concept.
He wants us to think about it not just as good versus evil, but as, what would drive a woman to make that kind of deal.
Exactly. He talks about the pressures, the desperation. These women had no control over their lives. Maybe for some, that pact was just a way to get some of that control back.
Like that story of the Bride of Corinth, right?
Hmm.
She's forced into a convent, denied love and freedom, so she chooses death.
And even in death, she rejects the rules, she comes back and chooses to be with the one she loves, even if it means breaking all the rules, the societal rules, the religious rules, all of them.
It's powerful stuff, and it makes you think about all those women who supposedly made deals with the devil. Maybe for them, it wasn't about evil, it was about saying no to a system that was crushing them.
Absolutely. It's about wanting to live your own life, make your own choices. And we see that over and over again with the witch. Whether she's healing people, participating in the Sabbath, or supposedly making pacts with the devil, it's this refusal to be controlled.
It's like she's saying, I'm not going to let you dictate my life. But let's not forget, she was also this incredibly knowledgeable healer.
Oh yeah, Michelet doesn't let us forget that. He talks about the comforters, those powerful plants they used, but also how dangerous they were.
So they were helping people, but risking their own lives to do it. I mean, using those plants, especially when the church is cracking down on any kind of knowledge they don't control, that was really brave.
It was. And that brings us to something really important that Michelet points out. The church didn't just want to stamp out competition. They wanted to control knowledge itself.
So the witch, with her knowledge of herbs and healing, that was a direct threat.
Right, because she knew things the church didn't want her to know. And it makes you think, how much knowledge was lost just because it threatened those in power?
It's a scary thought, but it's a pattern that repeats itself throughout history, doesn't it? Control the information, control the people.
It does, yeah. And while the witch might have eventually faded, her story reminds us how important it is to question authority, to look at different perspectives, to value knowledge, even when it comes from outside the mainstream.
It's like she's showing us, even now, that we have to fight for that right to know, to understand the world in different ways.
And Michelet shows us that fight's never really over. Even as the witch hunts ended, even as the world seemed to embrace reason and science, that desire to control, to suppress, it didn't just vanish. It just changed form.
So how did it manifest itself in this new, more enlightened era?
Well, one example Michelet points to is really fascinating, the rise of demonology. But here's the twist. It was demonology as a science.
Yeah, it's almost like they tried to, rationalize the irrational.
Yeah. But wouldn't that just give them, I don't know, more power to control people? I mean, if you can label any unusual behavior as demonic, well...
Exactly. It created this whole new system for, keeping people in line. Anyone who didn't fit in could be seen as a threat, possessed, bewitched, dangerous.
Michelet talks about some pretty disturbing cases from that time, like Father Gaufridi, Urban Grandier, Madeleine Bevent, all accused of witchcraft and, demonic stuff. But the evidence was often pretty flimsy.
And a lot of it was driven by, personal grudges or political stuff. It shows how those old fears about witches, especially, women with power, it never really went away.
No, it didn't. And that story about Sister Carrière, it's just heartbreaking. I mean, she was just a pawn in this whole power struggle within the church.
Mm.
It is a tragic story. And it shows how that fear of female sexuality, of women's power, it was still there, lurking beneath the surface, even in this supposedly enlightened era.
But Michelet also talks about, a growing pushback against all this, right? People started to question the witch hunts, to speak out against them.
Yeah, he highlights some important figures like Johann Weyer, who really challenged those beliefs. And doctors, scientists, they started to offer different explanations for what was being called witchcraft. It was like a shift towards reason, towards a more humane way of looking at things.
So it wasn't just about ending the witch hunts. It was about taking back that right to knowledge, to understanding, moving away from fear and superstition.
Absolutely. And Michelet sees that as a positive step, Society was evolving, becoming less afraid to question things. But he also warns us, that it's an ongoing struggle. That urge to demonize anyone who's different, who challenges us, it's always there.
And that's what makes this whole discussion so relevant today, right?
Mm.
We may not be burning witches anymore, but we still see that same impulse to silence people, to shut down anyone who doesn't agree with us.
It's true. Michelet's book, it's not just about the past. It's like a mirror, reflecting our own capacity for both good and bad. It makes us think about how we treat people who are different, who have beliefs we might not understand.
It's a challenge to, look at our own biases, to really question what we believe, and to resist that urge to just label anyone who's different as, the enemy.
I think that's a great takeaway from this deep dive. We've seen how the witch was demonized, how she was a victim of those societal forces, but also how she represents this enduring spirit of resistance, of seeking knowledge, of fighting for autonomy. It's a story that continues to resonate with us today, and it asks us to examine our own beliefs, our own fears, and how we choose to treat those who are different.
And that's a conversation we all need to be having, I think, not just about the witch, but about anyone who's been marginalized, silenced, or demonized for being different. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to thank you for taking us on this journey through the world of the medieval witch. It's been eye-opening, to say the least. And for our listener, I encourage you to continue this exploration. Pick up Michelet's book, do some research, keep asking questions, and most importantly, don't be afraid to challenge your own assumptions. Because the witch's story is not just about the past, it's about us and the kind of world we want to create.